Pisces. I want to clear something up about the title before we go any further, because I don't want you sitting in the wrong feeling for the next 24 hours. Ignoring this sign is not an option for you. Sounds like a warning, like something bad happens if you miss it. That isn't what these cards are telling me, and I want to correct it immediately. Nothing goes wrong if you happen to look away at the wrong moment. There's no penalty sitting behind this sentence. What it actually means is simpler and, honestly, more remarkable than a threat. It means this sign is going to be specific enough, matched precisely enough to something private you've been carrying that not noticing it is going to be genuinely difficult. Not forbidden, difficult. The way it's difficult to walk past your own name written somewhere you didn't expect to see it. I want to describe that comparison a little further because it's the clearest way to understand what's coming. If you saw your own name, spelled correctly, written somewhere completely unexpected on a sign, in a message, on a piece of paper you happen to pick up, you wouldn't need to be warned to pay attention to it. You simply would automatically, because your own name catches your eye, whether you're looking for it or not. That's the exact quality this reading is describing, not a threat that forces your attention. A precision so personal that your attention goes there on its own. I want you to understand the actual mechanism of what's coming, because it'll help you recognize it the moment it happens, rather than a week later, in hindsight, wondering if that was it. Most signs are vague enough to apply to almost anyone. A stranger's kind word, a number that repeats, things that could be meaningful, sure, but could just as easily be nothing. What's coming in the next 24 hours isn't that. It's specific. It's going to match something you've been quietly hoping for, privately, for a long time, with a precision that's considerably harder to wave off as coincidence. I want to explain why I'm structuring this reading around precision rather than simple encouragement, because it changes what you actually do with the next day. A vague, general good things are coming reading asks nothing specific of you. This one does. It's asking you to actually stay present enough over the next 24 hours to notice something that's going to be aimed directly at you, rather than scattered broadly enough to apply to anyone watching this video. Let me show you exactly what this looks like. Let me turn the first card. There, immediately. That's the actual event, and I want you to see the size of it before anything else. This is the figures rising up out of open graves, arms lifted, faces turned toward a great trumpet sounding above them. Everything that was buried finally called up into full light. This is a genuine calling forward, not a subtle hint you have to squint to interpret. I want to describe the quality of this card specifically, because it's the least ambiguous card in the entire deck. There's no fog in this image, no partial visibility, no room for a person to reasonably say afterward that they weren't sure what they'd experienced. When this card describes something, it describes something unmistakable. I want to point out that the figures in this image aren't straining to hear the trumpet. They're already responding to it, arms raised, faces lifted, before we even see what's making the sound. That immediacy is the key to understanding your next 24 hours. Whatever this miracle actually is, you're not going to have to work to notice it. It's going to arrive with enough clarity that your body responds before your mind has even finished processing what happened. I want to describe the graves themselves in this image, because they're open rather than sealed, and that detail matters more than it first appears to. Whatever's been waiting to surface wasn't lost or buried permanently. It was simply resting, held in place until the right moment arrived to call it up, the way a seed waits underground for the exact combination of conditions that finally lets it rise. Nothing about what's coming was ever gone. It's simply been below the surface, gathering itself, until now. I also want to point out the sheer number of figures rising in this image, more than one, responding together to the same call. That plurality suggests this isn't a solitary, private event happening only inside your own experience with nobody else involved. Something larger is stirring, and you're part of a moment that has real weight and real presence to it. Not a small, easily dismissed flicker that only you would ever register as significant. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know exactly what this miracle actually answers. There it is. And this is where the specificity I mentioned earlier really becomes clear. This is a single hand extending from a cloud, holding a golden chalice overflowing with water, 5 distinct streams pouring from the rim, a small white dove descending toward it with something delicate held in its beak. This is the answer to something specific, not a generic wave of good feeling. I want to describe exactly why this card confirms the precision I opened this reading with. Look at the dove again. It's bringing something particular down into the overflow, one small, deliberate detail delivered directly, rather than the cup simply filling on its own from an unspecified source. That detail matters enormously, because it tells me what's coming isn't a broad, could apply to anyone kind of blessing. It's aimed, it's carrying something exact. I want you to think right now about the specific thing you've been quietly hoping for. Not the version you'd say out loud if someone asked you generally what you wanted. The private one. The one you've stopped saying even to yourself, because saying it made the absence of it hurt more. That's what this dove is carrying. Whatever that private hope actually is, this reading is telling me it's about to be addressed directly, not brushed past with something vaguely nice instead. I want to describe the 5 separate streams overflowing from this cup because their number matters here specifically. This isn't a single, narrow answer to one specific detail. It's broader than that, touching multiple facets of the same underlying hope at once. If your private wish has several layers to it, the outcome itself, and the relief that would come with it, and what it would mean about you finally being seen or believed, this card is telling me all of those layers get addressed together, not just the surface level version of what you asked for. I also want to point out the calm water this overflow is landing on, undisturbed despite the intensity of what's pouring into it. That calm matters, because it tells me the ground this arrives on is already prepared to receive it. This isn't going to land somewhere unstable, somewhere it might get lost or wasted before you fully register what happened. It's arriving into conditions that are already quietly ready for it. Let me pull a clarifier, because I want to know exactly how soon 24 hours actually means. There it is. And this confirms the timing precisely. This is the great wheel itself, turning steadily, a sphinx seated fixed at the top, everything below rising and falling around that unmoving center point. This is the turning point, and I want to be direct about what 24 hours means here, because vague timing helps nobody preparing for something this significant. This isn't a loose, symbolic time frame meant to create urgency without actually meaning anything specific. The wheel in this card is already in motion. It's not waiting to start turning. It's mid-turn right now while you're listening to this, and the completion of that turn lands inside the window this title already gave you. I want to describe why the timing is this tight, because it matters for how seriously you take the next day. Wheels like this one don't stay balanced at the top of their turn for long. Once enough has built up underneath, and something has clearly been building quietly for a while now, the turn happens quickly, considerably faster than the slow, uncertain waiting that came before it. That's exactly the shape of your next 24 hours. Not a long, gradual unfolding. A turn that's already underway, completing itself close enough that you genuinely need to be paying attention, rather than treating this as some distant, someday possibility. I want to point out the Sphinx seated fixed at the top of this wheel, because its stillness matters for how you should hold the day itself. Everything around that fixed center is in motion, rising, falling, changing rapidly, and at the very core, something stays completely steady, unaffected by the churn happening around it. That's available to you too, throughout the next 24 hours, even while everything else moves quickly around you. You don't need to match the frantic pace of the turning wheel. You can hold the Sphinx's calm instead, trusting the timing without needing to anxiously track every hour as it passes. I also want to describe the 4 fixed figures often shown in the corners of this card, because they suggest something worth naming clearly. Whatever foundational parts of your life are already stable, your sense of who you are, your ordinary daily rhythm, the people you already trust, those stay anchored throughout this entire turn. This isn't a card about your whole life being thrown into upheaval. It's about one specific situation, the one connected to this private hope, finally completing its turn, while everything else around it continues exactly as it was. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know exactly how far back this actually started. And this one goes further back than I expected, so let me channel it exactly as it's arriving. This is a figure standing at the edge of a cliff, back turned, looking out over calm water at 3 tall ships sailing in the distance, staffs planted firmly in the ground beside them. This has been in motion for longer than you'd naturally guess. I want to be specific about what this card is confirming, because it changes how you should understand what's about to happen. This isn't a miracle assembling itself from nothing in the last day or two. It's the arrival point of something that's been sailing toward you for a genuinely long stretch of time, set in motion by things you did or hoped for or quietly kept believing in, long before you had any reason to expect a result. I want to describe why this matters so much for the specificity this reading keeps returning to. A miracle that arrives out of nowhere, unconnected to anything you've actually lived through, is easy to dismiss as random chance. A miracle that turns out to be the delayed arrival of something you set in motion yourself, sometimes years ago, is considerably harder to wave off, because tracing it back reveals an actual chain of cause and effect rather than pure luck. That traceability is part of what makes ignoring this genuinely difficult. Once you see the thread connecting it back, you won't be able to convincingly tell yourself it was nothing. I want to describe the posture of the figure in this card because it's telling in a way worth naming directly. The back is turned to us, facing outward toward the ships rather than toward whoever's viewing the card. That's unusual for this deck, where most figures engage directly with the viewer. This one has already turned away from the small, immediate view of daily life and is looking at something further out, something that requires patience and distance to properly see arriving. I also want to point out that the ships in this image are already visible, already sailing, not still being built somewhere out of sight. Whatever set this in motion has already done its work. You're not still in the phase of planting or hoping without evidence. You're in the phase of watching something you already set, moving finally come close enough to reach shore. That's a completely different position than uncertainty, even though it might have felt like uncertainty for a long stretch of the waiting. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know whether anyone else notices this alongside you. There. And this tells me the confirmation doesn't stay private. This is a figure riding through a crowd of cheering people, a laurel wreath already resting on the head, a staff decorated with another wreath held upright, moving at an easy, confident pace. This is public, at least in part. I want to describe what that means specifically because it changes the shape of how you should expect the next day to unfold. This isn't necessarily a miracle you experience entirely alone, quietly, with nobody else aware anything significant has happened. Some version of it is going to be visible to at least one other person, someone who's going to notice the change in you or witness the event itself alongside you or hear about it soon enough afterward that it becomes something shared rather than something you have to carry the reality of entirely by yourself. I want to point out that the rider in this image already has the laurel wreath resting there before the crowd has fully reacted to seeing it. That detail confirms something important. The miracle itself isn't contingent on anyone else's recognition of it. It's already real, already complete the moment it happens, regardless of who's watching. But you're not going to have to be the only witness to it either. There's a real chance someone else's reaction is part of how you first fully register what's occurred. I want to describe the steady, calm gaze of the rider, because it matters for how you should hold yourself once this becomes visible. There's no anxious checking of the crowd for approval, no uncertainty about whether the moment is real or will hold up. That calm confidence suggests whatever happens in the next 24 hours won't require you to convince anyone else of its significance. It's simply going to be obvious, the way genuine, confirmed things tend to be obvious, rather than needing defense. I also want to point out the cheering crowd surrounding this rider, genuinely engaged rather than politely acknowledging something out of obligation. If someone does witness this alongside you, their reaction is going to be real, unfiltered surprise or joy, not a polite nod that leaves you wondering if they actually understood the weight of what just happened. That genuine reaction is part of what will help confirm in the moment that you weren't imagining the significance of it. Let me turn the next card, because I want to know what it actually feels like in the moment it lands. There it is. And I want to describe this one carefully, because it's the quietest card in this entire reading, and that quietness matters. This is a figure kneeling at the edge of still water beneath an open night sky filled with stars, pouring water calmly from 2 jugs, completely unguarded, nothing rushed or dramatic in the posture at all. This is the actual feeling, once the initial recognition passes. Not chaos, not overwhelming disruption, but a specific, settled kind of awe. I want to describe why this matters for what you should expect, because miracle in the title might have primed you to picture something loud, something that visibly rearranges your entire day. That's not quite the texture this card is describing. It's quieter than that. Enormous in significance, genuinely, but landing with a kind of stillness rather than chaos, the way truly significant things often do once the initial shock of recognizing them settles. I want to point out that this figure has 1 foot resting on solid ground and 1 dipped into the water, completely unafraid of either. That balance is available to you too in the moment this actually happens. You don't have to fully abandon your ordinary day, your ordinary composure, in order to receive something this significant. You can hold both at once: genuine, quiet awe and the steady ground of an otherwise normal day continuing around it. I want to describe the 7 smaller stars surrounding the single large one in this card, because that configuration matters for what surrounds the central moment itself. This isn't just one isolated instant, brilliant but disconnected from everything else happening around it. There are smaller confirmations built into the same stretch of time, small, gentle details that reinforce the larger moment without needing to compete with it for attention. Watch for those in the hours immediately surrounding whatever the central event turns out to be. They're there, quietly, adding weight to what's happening. I also want to point out the utterly still surface of the water in this image. Even though what's arriving is significant, even though it's precisely matched to something you've hoped for privately for a long time, the actual emotional texture of receiving it stays calm rather than turbulent. That stillness is the deck's way of telling you not to expect drama or disruption. Expect clarity. Expect a settled, quiet certainty, arriving into a day that otherwise continues normally around it. Let me turn the last card, because I want to know what this all becomes once the full weight of it has settled in. There it is. And this is exactly the right note to end this reading on. This is a figure dancing at the center of a great wreath, a wand held in each hand, 4 fixed symbols positioned in each corner of the card. Everything about the image, whole, complete, arrived. This is completion, not the beginning of something you'll spend the following weeks still waiting to see the full shape of. What happens in the next 24 hours resolves something fully, rather than opening a new, longer stretch of continued uncertainty. I want to describe why this matters given everything this reading has already said about specificity and precision. A miracle this precisely matched to something you've privately hoped for doesn't usually arrive as a partial answer, requiring further waiting to see if the rest eventually shows up. It arrives whole, because it was built quietly over the entire stretch of time this reading has already described, and by the time it reaches you, there's nothing left unfinished about it. I want to point out the unbroken circle of the wreath surrounding the dancing figure, because completeness like that is genuinely rare in this deck. This is the card of arrival, not of motion, still in progress. Whatever's coming in the next day isn't a sign that something bigger is still forming somewhere down the line. It's the thing itself, complete, exactly as it's meant to be. I want to describe the 4 fixed figures, usually shown in each corner of this card, because they represent something worth naming clearly. They stay anchored, unmoving, regardless of the motion and celebration happening at the center. That fixed presence tells me this arrival doesn't destabilize anything else in your life. It arrives centered inside a structure that holds steady around it, rather than requiring anything else to shift or rearrange itself, simply because this one significant thing has finally completely resolved. I also want to point out that the figure is dancing, actively moving, rather than simply standing still inside the completed wreath. Completion here isn't passive or frozen in place. It's alive, joyful, genuinely in motion, even while being fully whole. That's an important distinction, because it tells you this arrival isn't going to feel like something quietly closing a door. It's going to feel like something opening into movement and life, even as it resolves completely, rather than leaving anything still hanging. Let me pull it together. Here's your reading. Within the next 24 hours, something arrives that's unmistakable rather than ambiguous. No fog, no room to reasonably wonder afterward whether you imagined it. It's specific, matched precisely to a private hope you've carried, one you've stopped saying out loud even to yourself. The timing is tight because the turning point is already underway, mid-motion right now, not a distant possibility, still gathering momentum. It traces back further than you'd naturally guess, connected to something real you set in motion long before you had reason to expect a result, which is exactly what makes it genuinely difficult to dismiss once you see the thread. At least part of it becomes visible to someone else, which means you won't be carrying the full reality of it entirely alone. And when it lands, it feels quieter than the word miracle might have led you to expect, settled awe rather than chaos, complete rather than the beginning of further waiting. I want to say the whole shape of this once more, cleanly, before turning to the practical instructions. What's coming isn't a vague, could apply to anyone gesture of goodwill from the universe. It's aimed. It's the arrival point of something you set in motion, sometimes long ago, meeting a private, specific hope you've carried, sometimes so quietly you'd stop saying it even to yourself. That combination, precision plus traceable history, is what makes ignoring it genuinely difficult. Not because anything punishes you for missing it, but because it simply won't look like nothing once it happens. Now, the practical part. First, stay reachable and present for the next 24 hours without needing to actively hunt for the sign. Because this arrives with unmistakable clarity, you don't need to scan anxiously for something ambiguous that could be it. Simply go about your ordinary day, staying reasonably present rather than distracted, and trust that when it happens, you'll know. Give yourself permission to actually put your phone down periodically, to be present in ordinary conversations, to not spend the entire day braced and watching. That kind of anxious vigilance tends to make people miss things rather than catch them, because it exhausts the attention that would otherwise be available for the actual moment when it arrives. Second, when it happens, let yourself feel the quiet awe fully, rather than immediately rushing to explain it away. There will be a temptation, especially given how significant this is, to reach quickly for a rational explanation that shrinks it back down to something ordinary. Let the explanation wait. Sit in the actual feeling first. Third, trace it back once the initial moment has settled. Spend some time later that same day or the next, actually thinking through how this connects to something you set in motion earlier, a decision, a hope you kept holding on to, an effort you made long before you had any evidence it would matter. That tracing is part of what makes this land as real rather than as a fluke you got lucky enough to receive once. Fourth, tell the person who witnesses it alongside you or hears about it soon after what it actually meant to you, rather than downplaying it out of habit. If someone's present for this or asks about it afterward, resist the urge to describe it as smaller or less significant than it actually was. Let them see the real size of what happened. Fifth, don't require the miracle to look a specific, pre-imagined way in order to count. You may have a particular picture in your head of what this should look like based on the word miracle itself. The actual arrival might take a shape you hadn't specifically pictured, while still matching the precise, private hope this reading has been describing. Stay open to the exact form of it, rather than only recognizing a version that matches your imagination precisely. This flexibility matters more than it might initially seem to. Sometimes people miss the actual sign because they were watching for a grander, more dramatic version, and the real one arrived quietly, in a form that didn't match the fantasy. Watch for the substance. Does it answer the private hope rather than the packaging? And sixth, the one that matters most. Let this be complete, rather than immediately wondering what comes next. Because this reading describes genuine arrival rather than the opening of a longer wait, resist the habit of treating good news as simply the first step towards something bigger you now need to start anxiously hoping for. Let it be whole, exactly as it is, for at least a little while before your attention moves anywhere else. This is worth naming directly because it's a habit a lot of people carry without noticing. The moment one hope is answered, some part of the mind immediately starts scanning for the next thing to worry about or wish for, robbing the actual arrival of the full attention it deserves. Give yourself explicit permission to simply stop there, at least for a day or two, and let this one thing be enough on its own. Okay. Small favor. When this actually happens and I'm being shown it's genuinely within this window, come back and drop the words, "I couldn't ignore it," in the comments. Just that. I couldn't ignore it. Because that's the actual test this reading has been describing. Not whether something good happens in the next day. Whether it happens with enough precision and clarity that looking away simply wasn't a realistic option, the way the title promised. And tell me, if you're willing, what the private hope actually was once it's been answered. Not before. I don't want you naming a hope that hasn't landed yet and risking talking yourself out of noticing the real one when it arrives in a different shape. After, once you know for certain, a lot of you are going to discover that the specific thing you'd quietly stopped saying out loud, even to yourself, is exactly what gets answered. There's something worth reading in that kind of comment section beyond the individual stories themselves. It's a pattern, confirmed by hundreds of different people describing hundreds of different private hopes, that the things we're most afraid to say out loud are frequently the exact things that end up being answered. That's worth remembering the next time you catch yourself going quiet about something you actually want. If these keep reaching you at the right moment, subscribe, there's more coming, and I want you here for it. So here's where I'll leave you. I keep thinking about the correction I made right at the start of this reading, the one about the title not actually being a threat. That correction matters more than it might have seemed at the time. You've spent a long stretch quietly hoping for something you were also quietly bracing to lose, the way people brace for disappointment after wanting something for long enough without receiving it. That bracing made sense. It protected you from repeated letdown. But it also means you may have been half expecting this reading and this next 24 hours to come with some kind of catch attached, a warning, a threat, a price for missing the sign. There isn't one. There was never one. What's coming is simply, plainly, going to be too specific, too precisely matched to what you've actually been hoping for, to convincingly explain away as nothing. That's not a threat. That's the kindest possible description of exactly how clearly you're about to be seen. I want to leave you with one final thought before I go, because it matters beyond just this specific 24 hours. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from wanting something so privately for so long that you've half convinced yourself nobody, not even the universe itself, actually knows what it is you've been hoping for. That loneliness makes sense. Private hopes stay private precisely because saying them out loud felt too risky, too exposing, too likely to be met with disappointment if you named them and they didn't come true. This reading is telling you something quietly remarkable about that private hope, whatever it actually is. It was never as unseen as it felt. Something has been tracking it quietly this entire time, and it's about to prove that by answering it with a precision that would be genuinely difficult to achieve by accident. You weren't shouting this hope from rooftops. You may have barely whispered it, even to yourself, on your hardest nights, and it was heard anyway. Keep your eyes open, not out of fear, out of anticipation. I'll see you at the next one.